Hello everyone, we are now live. My name is Mitch Hanley and I'm glad to say that we're joined from two members from the Tenant Deposit Scheme. So we're joined by Sandy Bastin, who is Head of TDS Adjudication Services, and Martin Wilks. So before we get started on this session, if Sandy and Martin, if you just want to take turns and introduce yourselves and just explain what you guys do at the TDS, and that'd be great.
Thanks very much, Mitch, and thank you for having us. Yes, so my name is Sandy Bastin. I'm Head of Adjudication Services at TDS. So I'm responsible for delivery of the adjudication decisions across our schemes in England and Wales insured, custodial, safe deposits in Scotland, and custodial insured scheme in Northern Ireland. Also for the deposit replacement product, zero deposit.
Hi, everyone. Oh, sorry, Mitch, go ahead.
You go ahead, Martin.
I was just going to say, my name is Martin Wilks. I'm an adjudicator with TDS. I've been doing this job now for in fact, I think I'm past 8 years now, thinking about it. And before that, I come from a legal background.
Nice stuff, brilliant stuff. So, yeah, and I'm Mitch Hanley from Hive. I'm the marketing manager here. Hive is a cloud-based property reporting platform where landlords, inventory clerks, and letting agents can create check-in reports, comparative checkout reports, mid-term inspections, and customizable reports as well. And we've recently been voted the best estate agent supply as well at the 2022 EA Masters. So that's the introductions. Before we get started on the session and answering your questions about all things deposit disputes, just going to do some house rules. So everyone will be on mute during the presentation. If you want to submit some questions, all you simply do is, if I just load up the next slide, so you'll see on the right hand side is a control panel. So to open up your control panel is just hit the red arrow button on the right hand side, and that'll open up your panel. And to submit your questions, just enter your questions here on the right hand side under the questions tab. So what we're going to do is we're going to split this session in two sections. So the first 15 minutes will be answering some pre-submitted questions that we've already got, but then on the second half of the session we'll answer your questions that you will have submitted. So do submit your questions and we'll answer those on the second part of the session. So let's get started. So here are some of the first pre-submitted questions we've got. So the first question is something else that I just point out as well, that Martin is obviously one of the main adjudicators at the TDS, so he'll be answering the majority of the questions, but Sandy will also chip in with some additional comments as well. So Martin, obviously this one is for you. So what is an adjudicator looking for in a check-in report?
Okay, well, I mean, one of the first things that I always check, there are some requisite pieces of information that we need. We need to have the address, so we need to make sure it's for the right property. It needs to be dated because, of course, we're looking to compare evidence of condition and cleanliness at the start and end of the tenancy, so we need to have it dated. I always look to see if there's a signature, because signature is really good evidence to show that the tenant has agreed with the content of the report, so that's quite persuasive. But generally what we're looking for is a comprehensive written report with supporting images. Best practice would be to have it professionally and independently prepared, but ultimately we're just looking for that evidence of condition and cleanliness at the beginning and end of the tenancy. There's a really useful guide on our website. If you go to the information lounge, there's an article there on best practice for inventories and the sorts of things that we expect to see in there.
Brilliant stuff.
If I may, Mitch, I think just to add there that the adjudicator really wants to see an agreed check-in document between the parties at the start of the tenancy. So wherever you can get the amendments made by the tenant at the start of the tenancy, or if they disagree with some aspect of the check-in report, then just make sure that you've acknowledged those amendments and that you both agree if any amendments are made. So really it's an agreed document as well at the start of the tenancy.
Brilliant. We've actually got, I think we had a pre-submitted question which we'll come across later about both parties agreeing on that. So hopefully we'll come across that one later on. So that's the first question. Nicely done. Thanks, guys. The next question we've got is, if a checking report is not signed, will an adjudicator still accept the evidence? So I know Martin just touched on there about having a professional report which is agreeable by both parties. So if the checking report is not signed, will an adjudicator still accept the evidence submitted?
Well, I mean, the short answer there is yes. I mean, whereas a signature might indicate agreement with the content, a lack of signature doesn't necessarily indicate disagreement. So tenants will often say, I didn't agree with the report, so I didn't sign it. But really, as long as that report's been provided, it's incumbent upon the tenant to question or challenge the content of the report. And as Sandy said, we're really looking for an agreed document. So the tenant should be raising these issues at the time, and the agent and landlord should really be responding to those as comments as well. So they should be challenging them if necessary or accepting them so that we can move towards that agreed document. But a lack of signature in and of itself doesn't undermine the evidence.
Nice stuff. Anything to add, Sandy, or happy with all that?
Yeah.
Brilliant stuff. So question number 3, again, if anyone's got any questions to submit, just click on the control panel on the right hand side and just enter your questions, and we'll answer those in the second half of the session. So what should a tenant do if they disagree with the findings of the inventory clerk?
Well, I mean, ideally, as I've just said, they really need to raise these issues. Too often I'll look at a case and the tenant says, well, it was like that at the start, you know, it was already damaged, but really we need to see evidence of that. If they're given a check-in report, then the tenant really should be going through that, especially at the start of the tenancy. You know, they're moving into the property, they're going to get to know that property really well. The check-ins generally, you know, or the agent will allow a certain period of time for the tenant to make these alterations if need be, but they should be setting them out very clearly, sending them off to the agent and trying to move towards that agreed document. One of the issues that we sometimes come across is if the inventory document is just that, it's a document, a paper document that's given to the tenant. Sometimes the tenant then is forced to email in their kind of discrepancies. And they might say very general things like the property was filthy, or, you know, it was really dirty, or it's in a poor state, and things like this. And in my experience, often nothing's really done in response to that. You know, the agent or landlord don't go back in and inspect it or ask for photographs, and we can't really narrow it down. And so these broad statements then, of course, have to be taken into account at the end. And the adjudicator will see that the tenant did raise that the property was unclean. And although it's lacking in the specifics, we have to accept that there were cleaning issues at the start of the tenancy. So, you know, ideally the tenant should be really pinning down what the issues are, communicating that with the agent landlord, and they really should be responding to it and getting that agreed document.
Yeah, so I suppose something else to potentially add there as well, Martin, is it's probably a good opportunity for the inventory clerk and agents and landlords as well, is to engage with the tenant at the start of the tenancy. If potentially providing a check-in report and just trying to get it signed off as quick as possible without any engagement or any grace period to add any comments, then that will encourage the tenant to help submit comments, because engaging with the tenant at the start of the tenancy will help reduce those disputes at the end as well. So I know we've got a process built in our software which enables that, so tenants can easily add photos and comments, but making sure engaging with that tenant helps reduce that dispute and builds a positive relationship going forward as well. So,
oh, absolutely. And I mean, the thing is as well is, even if you're getting your tenant to sign that check-in report and they sign it on the day they move in, and then they, within a few hours or a couple of days, discover something and email that in, it wouldn't be right for the adjudicator to just dismiss it because the inventory was signed. You know, we would still probably accept this timely report from the tenant once we can see that they've been into the property and had a full opportunity to inspect. So you're right, engage with the tenant, give them that period of time to fully inspect the property and agree the document, and then chase them for it if necessary. You know, try and get that agreed document. Don't just leave it to lapse. You know, get that agreed condition report at the start.
Perfect stuff. On to the next submitted question. With whom does the burden of proof rest with when making a claim against a deposit?
Well, I mean, obviously this is the tenant's money, you know, that's the best way to think about this. It's the tenant's own money. And so if the agent or landlord want to get some of that money to compensate them for a loss caused by a breach of the terms of the agreement, well, they're the ones that have got to prove it. And so we work to the same burden of proof that the court would. So it's the balance of probabilities, it's the civil burden of proof, which really means more likely than not, or if you wanted to attribute a percentage to it, 51% versus 49%. You know, you've just got to tip the balance ever so slightly. But remember, you know, this isn't a 50-50 starting point. You know, it's entirely on the agent or landlord to prove that case from a standing start. So they've got to reduce that evidence, they've got to bring that evidence into play, and we're looking for things like the tenancy agreement, check-in, check-out, any agreements to vary the terms of the agreement or consents to redecorate, things like that, all those photographs, invoices, receipts. That's the stuff that's going to tip the balance in their favour. But yes, it always rests with the agent or landlord to prove the claim.
Of course, yeah, I suppose with the agent and landlord, it's a massive asset that they've got to protect as well. Making sure they've got all those receipts, photos, documents in place, just in case there is a dispute. Obviously, making sure that's all in place means you're protecting the landlord's asset, and also, and with property prices going up quite high in the next few months, it's a big asset to look after. So
yeah, I think the other thing there is obviously it's documentary evidence based, so it's not possible to rely on a statement or one party's word against the other. So it must be evidence in the documents that Martin's referred to.
Brilliant stuff. Next question we've got submitted in is, if I only have photographs, can I still claim from a deposit? How useful are photographs? So we often get people sign up for a trial with Inventory Hive, and the amount of photographs we see put in inventory reports ranges from 1 or 2 photographs all the way to hundreds and hundreds. So so in your stance, how useful are photographs in property inspection reports?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting question, this really, because I think when we attribute a kind of label to the sort of evidence, then we can kind of get a bit hung up on whether we will accept photographs or whether we won't. Really, you know, if you think about it, what we're looking for is evidence of condition and cleanliness at the start and end of the tenancy that we can compare and determine whether the tenant has breached the terms of the agreement. So the answer to the first part of the question is, you know, perhaps, you know, some photographs, if they're dated and time-stamped and they clearly show the item that's in question at the start and end of the tenancy, then it's easy for the adjudicator to make that comparison. So photographs can help a claim to succeed. They can be the evidence that's required, even if that's the only evidence that you've got. But oftentimes, you don't know what items are going to fall into dispute. And so it's very difficult to photograph every aspect of the property. And that's why we always say best practice is a written report with supporting images. Those photographs support the written word. Photographs are really useful. You know, ideally, a proper photograph that's date and time stamped, as I say, and clearly shows the subject matter, that's great evidence for an adjudicator, because the adjudicator can see it. You know, it's as if they're there viewing what they're being told to view, you know. So in that respect, they are really, really useful. But as I say, sometimes, unfortunately, the photograph isn't there, or it's taken at different angles, or there isn't a direct comparison to be made from the start or end of the tenancy. And that's why we say written word is paramount, really.
Sorry, Mitch. The only thing I would add there is that, absolutely. So a photograph isn't going to be able to tell you whether a wall is freshly decorated or whether a carpet is new. So it's the written word as well, which accompanies those that are very useful.
You make a good point, Martin, as well, where you make a good point about how photos must be date and time stamped as well, because a lot of people can provide photographs, but there's no evidence of when that photo was taken. I feel like you've relayed that point quite a few times, and I assume you do get quite a few claims that do come in where they're not date and time stamped.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's difficult because, you know, back in the olden days, you know, 10, 15, 20 years ago, we all had digital cameras, and you could put the settings on so you get a little nice stamp in the corner of the photo with the date and the time. But of course, now everybody's doing it with an iPad or a phone. And so if you are going to do that, that's absolutely fine, but make sure that metadata, that extra information is available so that we can tell when that photograph was taken, because having contemporaneous evidence from the start and end of the tenancy is ultimately what we're looking for. And if it's not dated, it's the same as having an undated check-in or check-out report. You know, we just don't know it's relevant to that tenancy.
Brilliant stuff. Next question we've got submitted in is, why would an adjudicator not award the full cost to replace an item? So, and just to add something on top of this, what are the most common items where you might not award a full cost for?
Well, I mean, normally we see this in respect of replacement items. You know, a carpet's been so severely and extensively damaged it needs to be replaced, and the landlord wants the full cost of that replacement carpet. Well, of course, what we're alluding to here really is betterment. You know, the tenant can't profit from the tenant's, sorry, the landlord can't profit from the tenant's deposit. They're not entitled to a new for old replacement because we have to allow for reasonable usage of that item. You know, the landlord can't be put in a better position they would otherwise be, but for the breach of the tenancy by the tenant. So we won't be awarding new for old replacement costs for any replacement items. The other area that we sometimes see this as well is in respect of cleaning. If a check-in report, for example, says the property was cleaned to a good domestic standard, and then at the end it's cleaned to a poor or an average domestic standard, oftentimes we'll see a claim for £250, £300 for a full professional clean. But of course, what that's going to do is it's going to return the property to a professional standard of cleanliness, which is more than it was at the start of the tenancy. And so the landlord isn't going to be entitled to the full cost of that work either. They would only be entitled to the cost of raising that standard of cleanliness back to what it was at the start of the tenancy.
Lovely stuff. Anything to add to that, Sandy, or happy with that?
Yeah.
With what you said then? Nice. Next question we're going to look at is, can a landlord still claim for professional cleaning?
Well, I mean, that follows on quite nicely from what I just said.
Yeah.
The issue that we have here, I think, is that we had the Tenant Fees Act come in, and the guidance that was published by the government asks the question, you know, in the Q&A section at the end, it says, can a landlord charge me for professional cleaning? And this advice starts with no and a full stop. And so tenants have been reading this, and it's kind of propagated this idea that landlords can't claim for professional cleaning anymore. What the Tenant Fees Act says is that the tenant can't be obliged to pay for third-party contractors. So you can't enforce a term in a tenancy agreement which says the tenant will pay for professional carpet cleaning or professional cleaning of the property at the end of the tenancy. What we have to do is compare that check-in evidence with the check-out evidence and consider whether the tenant has fulfilled their obligation to return the property in the same state of cleanliness. And if they haven't, then of course the landlord will have suffered a loss because they've got a less clean property, they've got to raise the standard of cleanliness there. And of course they're entitled to instruct a contractor to carry out that work and claim back those costs. But it is only the cost of raising that standard of cleanliness back to what it was at the start of the tenancy. So you can still claim for professional cleaning if, for example, it was professionally cleaned at the start, and then at the end of the tenancy, the evidence clearly shows the tenant just packed a bag and walked out, and they left the place in a real mess. Then, of course, that £250, £300 to bring it back to a professional standard of cleanliness is going to be reasonable. And the adjudicator would make that award if it was reasonable to do so. So, you know, in theory, yes, but just be mindful of this requirement to make tenants pay for professional services or for third-party contractors.
Perfect stuff. We've had a few questions come in. We said we'll look at those in the second half of the session, but we'll just carry on looking at some pre-submitted ones first because we did have quite a few that came in. So the next question we've got in is, are receipts essential when making a claim? So this kind of leads on quite nicely from the previous question about claiming for professional cleaning. So are receipts essential? So I assume you get someone professional to do a job, getting an invoice or receipt and presenting that to the TDS. How does it all work, and how essential is that?
Well, obviously, really what we're looking for here is, has the tenant breached the terms of the agreement? So can we point to a clause in the tenancy agreement that the tenant hasn't fulfilled, or they haven't done what they were supposed to do? And has the landlord suffered loss as a result? Now, whether the tenant has breached the terms of the agreement is often proven by the tenancy itself, the check-in and the check-out report, oftentimes. But then we need to consider what the landlord's loss is and whether what they're claiming is reasonable. And to do that, invoices and receipts, estimates are really helpful, because they will indicate to an adjudicator how much it's going to cost to remedy the tenant's breach. So they're really useful pieces of evidence. But to say they're essential, probably not, because the adjudicator can ultimately rely on their own knowledge and experience and make sure that they're making a reasonable award to compensate the landlord for the loss. It's obviously better to provide that evidence, because then we clearly know how much it's going to cost the landlord, particularly if there's something about the item or area that's damaged that means it's going to cost a considerable amount of money to put right. You know, they're going to have to evidence that, because remember, the burden of proof is on the agent and landlord to do so. But not essential, but obviously very useful evidence for an adjudicator.
Just following on for that, because I think we've had a nice question just to follow on from that, is, so say if someone provides a receipt or an invoice or some work that's been done, what is there cases where that's been the cost has been exaggerated at all?
Well, I mean, it's very difficult for me to say that. I do come across cases where the amount that's claimed, even though it's supported by an invoice or receipt, just seems unreasonably high. And even in those cases, the adjudicator could, and I have done myself many times, make a lesser award because the amount that's shown in that invoice or receipt just seems unreasonably high. And that's why, as well, sometimes it's worth providing that little bit more explanation. You know, as a rule of thumb, the more money you're claiming, the more explanation, the more evidence you're often required to provide to support that claim. So if it is unusually high on the face of it, then provide that explanation. Maybe there's a justification for it, but without that justification, I might view that evidence and think that's just too much. I'm going to make a more reasonable award and make a lesser award than that's shown in the invoice or the receipt, even though the landlord has ultimately incurred those costs.
Perfect. Thanks, Martin. So just going to come across a couple of questions we've had submitted in to us. So first one we've had in is from Angela, and she asks, can you please also let me know if the tenants were mentioned that the TV and speakers were not working before they moved in by verbal and written confirmation, as if the landlord took them off, there would be holes in the walls. How do we stand? If you want me to repeat that, I can do, Martin.
Yeah, sorry, yeah. I'm just not sure what.
Can you please let me know if the tenants were mentioned that the TV and speakers were not working before they moved in by verbal or written confirmation, as if the landlord took them off, there would be holes in the walls. I think there's a couple of spelling mistakes in that one, but I think
perhaps that is perhaps that alludes to the TV and not being working, perhaps at the not being working at the start of the tenancy, at the end of the tenancy, or being missed. It's missing from the property, and therefore, if the tenant had notified that it wasn't working at the start of the tenancy and it's missing at the end, there would be perhaps holes in the walls if it had been removed. But generally speaking, the adjudicator would be looking to the check-in report to see evidence that the item was there at the start of the tenancy, and also to an indication as to whether or not that item was tested and working, because that's often what a clerk will provide by way of detail. And if the tenant had notified in writing, followed up by email, so there's good audit trail to advise that the television wasn't working at the start of the tenancy, then without any further evidence to confirm perhaps that the landlord went back in and repaired it, the adjudicator might reasonably conclude that it wasn't working at the start of the tenancy, and if therefore it was missing at the end of the tenancy, then a smaller award might be made because it's not working. I'm sorry if that's not what Angela, what you actually meant with that question.
Thanks, Sandy. Another question we've had in is from Maria, and she asks, what happens if the tenant does not raise a dispute within 3 months? Does the landlord need to raise this instead? So what happens if the tenant raises a dispute after the 3 months and the monies have already been released to the landlord after signing the indemnity form?
I'll take that one, Martin.
Yeah.
So obviously, under our insured scheme, the parties are not able to raise a dispute before 10 days after the end of the tenancy, so no sooner than 10 days and no later than 3 months. In our custodial scheme, it's possible for a dispute to be raised from the last day of the tenancy, and there is no deadline of 3 months. So if a tenant hasn't raised within 3 months, then the best thing obviously to do is to negotiate and try and reach agreement, so you don't have to come to dispute. But if they haven't raised within 3 months, then yes, it would be, and you wanted to use the alternative dispute resolution service, then you would need to ensure that an application was submitted within that 3-month period. The second part of the question, if the tenant hasn't raised within 3 months and the agent landlord hasn't raised also within 3 months, and the parties have utilised a letter of indemnity to release the funds, and the tenant then, well, the tenant wouldn't be able to raise a dispute after 3 months. So the only possible likelihood there would be that the tenant would perhaps take court action for the release of the deposit without agreement in writing. So in that scenario, you would just need to be very, very sure that the evidence that you had was sufficiently robust to persuade a court that the deductions that were made were fair and reasonable. And we do have a guidance on our website for what to do in the case that uncontactable tenant or a tenant that's not responding, and that can be found in our TDS lounge. So hopefully, Maria, you might find that useful.
Perfect stuff. Thanks for that, Sandy. I think we've got time for one more question. We're coming to the end of the session shortly, but so I'll just go through one more question. If a tenant leaves without any notice, should I still carry out a checkout report?
Well, I suppose the answer really is yes. If the tenant has left, then obviously you want to inspect that property. You want to see if the landlord has potentially suffered a loss as a result of the tenant's breach. They might have caused damage. They might have left it less clean. So yes, you might want to gather that evidence. I suppose if they're leaving without giving notice, you might think that the amount of rent that they owe because they haven't provided notice would swallow up the deposit. And so there's no need to record that evidence. And that, is a commercial decision, really. You could, if your claim for rent arrears is robust and it will swallow up the whole of the deposit, then of course we can only award up to the deposit amount. But ultimately, if you think kind of a little bit bigger than just the deposit itself, and Sandy's just spoken about this, there are other avenues to pursue, and you might want to pursue the tenant through the court for the dilapidations, for example. And so gathering that evidence at the end of the tenancy, I think, is always wise. And as Mitch says, these are high value assets, and it's right to protect the landlord as best as possible and to capture that condition and cleanliness at the beginning and end of each tenancy.
Perfect. Thanks for that, Martin. We've got 2 more minutes, so I'm just going to do one more, and then that should close us out. Can a claim be made for both cleaning and compensation?
The short answer to this is yes. If you've got, let's say, a big stain on a carpet in a really prominent location, and you engage the carpet contractors to come out and clean it, and they often work wonders. Some of the results that they get are fantastic. So you get a professional carpet cleaner in, and they do their best, and yet the carpet has still got this very unsightly, significant stain right in a prominent location. Well, it's right that the landlord should be entitled to compensation towards the replacement of that carpet. They've taken the reasonable steps of trying to clean it first, which is what an adjudicator would expect to see. And if that ultimately isn't successful, then of course a contribution towards replacement may well be justified. But of course, you've got to think a little bit about the evidence there, because your checkout report will show a stain or a mark, whatever, and you've had it cleaned. but then what? You know, the adjudicator needs some evidence to show that that cleaning was unsuccessful. So it's important to think then about either getting a second report done or updating the first report or capturing that evidence with photographs that are dated and time stamped, or that metadata is available for, to show that that cleaning was undertaken, but still that stain remains and it is significant enough to justify the replacement of the carpet.
Nice stuff. Thank you very much, Martin, and thank you as well, Sandy. That pretty much concludes our session today. Before we leave, did Martin, Sandy, do you want to say anything before we finish off the session at all?
No, other than just thank you very much for inviting us, and I hope you found it useful. And if there are any other questions that we haven't been managed to get to, then more than happy to look at those.
Yeah, perfect. I'll what we'll do is, obviously we've had some more questions come in at the very end, and we'll try and get back to those after the session today. I know later on this week the TDS do run some nice foundation and adjudication courses, so do take a look at their website and sign up for those if they're of interest to you guys. I know Martin runs with those sessions as well, so have a look at the TDS website and have a look at those adjudication and foundation courses as well. And we also run some on-demand courses as well with Hive and the TDS. So those on-demand courses about how you can create pre-tenancy inventory reports and checkout reports, as well as mid-term inspections as well. So again, thank you to everyone for your time today. Thanks for those that submitted pre-submitted questions and questions live on the session today. Want to say a special thanks to Martin and Sandy today. Their expertise have been really valuable for myself and those that have attended today. So thanks again to everyone, and any questions, just get in touch with Hive or the TDS and we'll be more than happy to help. So thanks again, guys, and anything else, please be in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you.